As we mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld Governor Walker's signature labor legislation, Act 10, in one of three major rulings.
The court upheld a requirement also that voters show photo identification at the polls, but that law remains blocked in federal court. Barry Burden is a professor of political science at UW-Madison and an expert on election administration. Welcome back to Live at 5.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Nice to see you. So, were you surprised at the way the judges ruled on these three laws?
Not really. We know that it's a conservative court. We know the kinds of questions that were being asked during the hearings for both of these cases, all three of these cases. And so the votes on the court really fell in line with what we thought would happen.
Okay, well, let's talk about Act 10. Let's get that one going. Do you think this is the end of the road then for Act 10?
I do, and I think this was the most important decision today. This ends really 3 years of battle in the legislature and in the courts. There have been state court decisions, federal court decisions. This is really the end of the road, and I think Act 10 probably now stands.
You don't think there's any stamina left for a lawsuit on behalf of MTI to take this to the next level? Is this an issue that you could see going all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court potentially?
I think it's really hit the end of the road. There aren't many venues out there still for these litigants. They've tried, again, state courts, federal courts, county district courts, and at all those levels, it's really come to an end. So I think Act 10 is probably here to stay unless a future legislature and governor want to change it.
Well, let's ask this question because we saw Jessica Arp at the top of our newscast, and she said, you know, local unions insist this is not the end of them. But should they be concerned? And going forward, you know, how do you think this falls out for the rest of the state? Two questions, I guess.
Well, the unions really have to rely on the kindness of the people who employ them to honor those contracts because they're not required to do it any longer under Act 10. I think in Madison, you'll see probably teachers and public employees have their contracts honored and probably renewed at some point, maybe in Milwaukee. But at the state level and in a lot of the rest of the state, those employers are not obligated to honor them. And with Act 10 in place, really, I think unions in the public sector are a disappearing breed.
What about the voter ID law? Is there any scenario where this could be in place for the fall election?
There's a scenario. This one is not quite dead. Again, it's complicated because there are both state cases and federal cases. The federal decision was decided earlier this year in April. This is the end of the state line. But the federal case is being appealed to an appeals court in Chicago, the 7th Circuit, by the Attorney General here. And it's possible that appeals court could weigh in before the election.
Okay. It feels like this one, it feels like this one has some legs. Like we have a while to go on these.
Yeah, and there are various elements. The federal court decision was about different issues than the state court decision was. Today's decision was really about the state constitution and whether the law violated it. The conservative majority said no. The federal decisions are really about the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. There, the court made a different decision, but again, it's being appealed. So this one is not quite at the end of the line just yet.
Sure.
What, if anything, do you think these decisions will have on the governor's race?
They will keep them alive. It will remind voters that Act 10 is really the signature element of the Walker administration. One of the very first things he did when he came to office. It was a source of great debate in the state, still a lot of divided opinion about that. And I think it just keeps it on the agenda as one of the talking points this fall. Voter ID the same way, because it's unresolved, because again, it was something passed in the first year of the Walker administration. It'll be part of the debate as we go into the fall election.
A lot more talking to do. I mean, this has really been just a busy day, you know, and the thing that I wanted to say, you know, not to insult anyone's intelligence, but I mean, this has been a really big day in the court system, and so certainly a lot of debate there. Yeah.
How would you categorize it in terms of what kind of a big day it is?
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of a full-time job for the voter to keep track of all these cases and what's happening, and it's sort of unfair of the state Supreme Court to dump all of these on us all at once and try to make sense of them. Certainly an important day, probably one of the most important days in the history of the state Supreme Court.
Well, we're very grateful that you were here to help us have a little context and perspective on these issues.
Glad I could help.
And we'll talk to you again soon because it's not over till it's over, as we said. All right, Barry, nice to see you. Thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks.